Ladies and gentlemen, a very good morning and welcome to the seminar on the India Budget 2013. I would appreciate if you could, I would like to request if you could switch your mobile phones and other beeping devices to silent mode throughout the seminar. Please bear with us for a few minutes as the first speaker, Mr. P.K. Basu, is actually on his way up. He was actually stuck in traffic. Thank you very much. Good morning, Your Excellency Dr. T.C.A. Raghavan, India's High Commissioner to Singapore, Professor Rajendra Srivastava, Provost and Deputy President, Academic Affairs, Singapore Management University, representatives of supporting organizations, distinguished guests and speakers, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the seminar on the India Budget 2013. To start the proceedings, it is my pleasure to invite Professor Rajendra Srivastava to deliver the opening remarks. Professor Srivastava, please.
Your Excellency, Dr. T.C.A. Raghavan, High Commissioner of India, members of SMU's advisory boards, fellow panelists and speakers, business leaders, and academic colleagues, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. A very good morning and a warm welcome to Singapore Management University and to the joint seminar on the Indian Budget 2013. This gathering of representatives from government, from academia, from industry is very important to us at SMU for a variety of reasons. I'm a marketing person, so it's always dangerous to put me up here to begin with. So let me take the opportunity to talk a little bit about SMU and the alignment of SMU to the Singapore-India corridor. SMU is a very young university. We're in our 12th year. Next year, we will officially be a teenager. We're trying to make as much trouble as we can. And I think this particular event is very much in keeping with what we are trying to do at SMU. As a management university centered around the world of business and society, we are very cognizant of the fact that the best contributions that we can make to our corporate partners as well as to our academic partners worldwide will be the development of market knowledge and insights about our own backyard, which is ASEAN, India, and China. Consequently, we are committing a lot of resources to the development of these insights. And the president is in charge of the China efforts. We have several deans involved in ASEAN. And when it comes to the India initiatives, my neck is on the line. So I'm very grateful for you guys being here, and I'm looking forward to all the help that you guys can provide us. A couple of comments. We are collaborating with both academic and corporate sectors that are linked to India. In October, we launched the India initiatives with the Singapore-India Business Dialogue. And a big coup is, and we're so delighted that Mr. Ratan Tata will be visiting us in this very room on March 15th. And so we are looking forward to further alignment. We are working closely with the IITs and IIMs. We're looking at a program on innovation with IIT Kanpur. We're working with IIM Bangalore on things like wealth management. And we are working with Indian Institute of Foreign Trade when it comes to trading issues, which are very, very important to our city-state. We have working with these organizations. Last year, we hosted on April 5th and 6th, helped co-host the Pan IIT conference. And this year, coincidentally, on the same days, April 5th and 6th, we are the knowledge partner to the Impact, to this global conference for Indian Institutes of Management. We are also involved in joint research, principally in the areas of financial markets and institutions, innovation and entrepreneurship, in business analytics, and also in the development of management as well as educational talent in collaboration with the Indian universities. We also are beneficiaries of our partnership with companies such as Tata's, and we have Tata representatives here. And we're also looking at working with the State Bank of India. Our Indian students at SMU could use some funds, so we're grateful for those efforts. We are working with the Confederation of Indian Industries on topics such as business model innovation. We've worked with them in Bangalore, and most recently in January in Agra at the global conference. And we're thankful to the Singapore Indian Chamber of Commerce and Industry, as well as the Singapore Business Federation, and our business partners such as PricewaterhouseCoopers. Our education business is really a people business. And therefore, these networks that we have, whether it's with CII or it is with the academic institutions or with the corporate community, these are very, very critical to SMU from the viewpoint of learning. I'm especially grateful to Dr. Raghavan for both suggesting and co-sponsoring the seminar. He's been working very hard behind the scenes, not only in recruiting our key speaker and the main actor. I think what you see out here is the warm-up act. The real act is going to be via video. And I want to recognize that this event is being webcast globally and also being webcast back to India. So please smile because you may be on camera. Okay. I'm also delighted to note that fully 2/3 of the people in this room are here because of the invitation sent out by the Indian High Commission and our partners in this event. So welcome. For those of you for whom this is the first time coming to SMU, welcome to SMU. We look forward to working with you further, and we look forward to your help in developing Asian insights. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Srivastava. It is now time for the presentations on the India budget. We have two distinguished speakers with us this morning. I shall invite them to make their presentations. Following that, we shall have the question and answer session. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. P.K. Basu is the Managing Director and Regional Head of Research and Economics at Maybank Kim Eng Securities Private Limited. He will provide us with an overview of the India budget. Mr. Basu, please.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency, the High Commissioner, Dr. Srivastava, and distinguished members of the audience. Thank you for having me. The Indian economy has been one of the fastest growing economies in the world over the past 25 years. Unfortunately, it is currently facing its period of slowest growth in a decade. Real GDP growth slowed to just 4.5% year on year in the latest quarter. And so this year's budget was a particularly challenging one for the finance minister. He was having to grapple with both the need to rein in the fiscal deficit, which is still running at closer to 5.8% of GDP. He needed to rein that in to 5.3% by the end of this month, and rein it in further, he said, to 4.8% by next year, by the end of March 2014. So that was his first key challenge. But the second key challenge was to also ensure at the same time that he did enough to improve the investment climate to ensure that the economic momentum could be turned around. And all this at a time when this government is really on its last legs. It has about 14 months to go in its current term in office. And typically, the last budget of a government is the most populist budget, in India especially. So given that these were the challenges, how has he dealt with them? Well, he has come up with a fiscal deficit target of 5.3% of GDP for the current fiscal year, which now has just about 3 weeks to go, and 4.8% for next year. I think to some degree, he has succeeded at least in meeting the basic goal of credibly raising sufficient revenue and cutting back on expenditure to get close to these targets. I think it's very unlikely that we'll get to 4.8% of GDP next year. Let me just show you a few reasons why it'll be a bit challenging. If you look at this slide here, the chart on the right is the fiscal deficit on a 12-month rolling sum basis. So for each month, the government actually reports the fiscal numbers. If you look at this on a 12-month moving average basis, you can look at what the actual fiscal deficit is doing currently. It is currently at about 5.8% of GDP, just short of 6. On a 12-month moving average basis, the fiscal deficit is running at 5.8% of GDP as of January. So there are just 2 months to go in the fiscal year. In the budget, most of the provisions in the budget really will have an impact on the next fiscal year. There is perhaps a little bit of room to do a lot of disinvestments in the last 3 weeks of the year. But it does seem that the 5.8% of GDP target, 5.3% of GDP target is rather difficult to achieve, except for the fact that the final month of the fiscal year, March, is the biggest month for revenues. And so if all goes well, including things like the increases in gold import duties and so on, then we'll probably get to about maybe 5.4, 5.5, slightly closer to that 5.3, but I think 5.3 will be quite difficult to achieve. So at the same time, India now faces a twin deficit. Of course, the fiscal deficit is large, but the trade deficit has also been widening quite sharply and has hit new record levels. This is a 12-month moving average of the trade deficit. This year, the current account deficit for India should be about 4.5% of GDP. That is a record for any fiscal year. So the economic backdrop is not at all propitious. But what has he done to deal with this? I think the key aspect is he has raised import duties on gold and silver to try and ensure that some of India's enormous appetite for the precious metals results in a benefit to the government as well, and you get a little bit of a reduction in those imports. But clearly, this remains a very significant challenge. The other challenge that he faces, of course, was the growth challenge. And let me just point out what the growth challenge is. This is the real GDP number for India. It has been decelerating rather sharply. Now, 4.5% GDP growth now in the latest quarter is really dismal for a poor developing country. India should be growing 9 to 10%. And the reason why it should be growing 9 to 10% is best illustrated by pointing to this. Sorry, I think I overdid that. Here, the key reason why India should in fact be the fastest growing economy in the world right now is because India's demographics are enormously beneficial. This chart shows the dependency ratio of various countries around the world. And the dependency ratio is a proportion of the proportion of the population outside the working age group relative to the proportion of the population in the working age group. As the dependency ratio falls, the national savings rate rises, and that boosts the investment to GDP ratio. And if investment rises as a percent of GDP, that should typically mean that you get a boost to productivity. And stronger productivity growth is, of course, the ultimate guarantor of prosperity. That is the sort of benefit that Korea began to experience around 1965. All the way from there, the dependency ratio declined all the way down to about 2010. And in China, it began to happen in 1978 or so and continued until last year. From this year onwards, China's dependency ratio starts to rise. Korea's began to rise about 2 or 3 years ago. Japan's began to rise in 1990. India's dependency ratio is going to be declining for another 25 years. So during that period, the savings rate should be rising, the investment to GDP ratio should be picking up, and the economy should be accelerating substantially further, which was what was happening until about 3 years ago. But the economic slowdown that has now occurred over the last 2 years is a very serious challenge, and it is something that requires aggressive action. To some degree, this government began to take some of those actions. I would credit the next speaker, the speaker after next, Dr. Raghuram Rajan, with a great deal of credit for reigniting the process of economic reform in India. Soon after he took office as Chief Economic Advisor, you began to see a whole spate of economic reforms. India raised fuel prices and opened up several sectors to foreign direct investment. In particular, multi-brand retail, aviation, insurance, etc. So with that, there was a new burst of economic reform, coupled with the fact that oil prices were raised, thereby reducing the subsidy bill, which will have an impact in the current fiscal year, but also in the next fiscal year. So those reforms, I think, do help at least to check the deceleration in economic activity. But they probably are not enough to get India back up to the 9 to 10% growth path immediately. So we'll probably have to depend on next year's election to bring about the changes needed to really get growth going again. As I said, given the demographics only come once this sort of demographic dividend is not going to be repeated. So India has another 20 years to benefit from this demographic dividend. This is an opportunity not to be missed. Unfortunately, the last 2 or 3 years have been rather bad on that front. Now, one very important aspect of why the fiscal situation is this dire is because this government has gone on a spending spree. Normally, I'm a real bull on India. I've been a lifelong bull on the Indian economy. So it's a bit painful to be standing here talking about all that has gone wrong. Unfortunately, much has gone wrong. So there's no getting away from the fact that much has gone wrong in the last 2 or 3 years. In particular, there's been a burst of populist spending on something called the NREGA, National Rural Employment Guarantee Act, that is one major cause of the deterioration of the fiscal balance. Second, of course, the government was quite slow with subsidy reform. There has certainly been significant progress on that front. This year's budget includes a provision of 10,000 crores, or about 100 billion rupees, for something called the Food Security Bill. I would say that this is the thin end of the wedge, or the small part of the iceberg that you can see above the surface. Below the surface, there's lots of ice. So this is the thing that can sink the Titanic of India's fiscal position. Only a provision of 100 billion rupees for the Food Security Bill. Most estimates are that to really fund the Food Security Bill, you need about 5 times that, even in the first year, and probably a lot more in subsequent years. So I'd say this item, the 100 billion rupee provision for the Food Security Bill, is the real issue and question that we'll have to address to the eminent Dr. Raghuram Rajan when he comes on. The government, of course, is going for a fairly ambitious program of disinvestment. This finance minister has been a little more aggressive with that, but this year's disinvestment target will be missed, and next year's will be quite difficult to achieve. But the point is that disinvestment is another aspect that this government wants to do quite a bit of. Also, I think the government, towards the end of the fiscal year, may require the public enterprises to pay larger dividends to the government, and that too will provide a basis for stronger revenues at the end of the fiscal year. Finally, I think that there is one aspect of the budget that I would particularly commend, which is the introduction of an investment allowance. An investment allowance is something that in Singapore and Malaysia is taken for granted. Anytime you invest, you're able to take a very substantial allowance and pay lower taxes on it. India has introduced an investment allowance in this year's budget, which I think is a positive. This is especially important for the simple reason that the slowdown in the economy over the past year has come primarily from a slump in capital goods output. Capital goods output collapsed over the last 2 years and is beginning to turn around, but is not quite in positive territory yet. If you look to this period, most of the growth in India's economy since 2003 has come from a massive investment boom. Of course, if you invest more, that boosts productivity and boosts prosperity across the economy. If you're investing less, then you have a real problem. And so turning around investment spending is really the key aspect of this year's budget. And I think the investment allowance certainly is an important provision helping to bring that about. And hopefully this is the end of the slump in capital goods output. We should begin to see capital goods doing better. I don't want to leave you with only negativity. There are a couple of things that this government has done very quietly that deserve credit and that will boost India's economy in the medium term. The most important is something called the UIDAI, the Universal ID scheme that has been run by Nandan Nilekani. And already about 350 million Indians have these UID cards where you have 12 pieces of biometric information, all 10 fingerprints and the irises of your 2 eyes recorded on a card. This is almost a fail-safe method of identification, a unique identification system. And most of those 350 million people live in rural India. I'd say 80% of them currently don't have bank accounts. And the fact that they will have a universal ID card means that subsidies can be much better targeted towards those who really need them, A. B, they can actually, money can actually be transferred directly to the beneficiary, which means it cuts out all the intermediaries and all the scope for corruption and rent seeking along the way. And therefore, in the medium term, this is absolutely transformative. We owe a great deal of, a great debt to Nandan Nilekani, who has fought battles with the right and the left. In India, every issue, every economic reform measure meets severe resistance from the right and the left. They all come up with fantastic arguments for why it is awful. And so the UID scheme was considered awful by the right and the left. You can be sure that that's a good measure if both the right and the left are attacking it. In the end, and by the way, the Home Minister at the time, who is currently Finance Minister, also opposed the thing tooth and nail, any case. But now it is almost done, and the Finance Minister, current Finance Minister, is basking in the glory of its being completed. And he is now making that a key provision that will apparently enable the Congress to win the next election, because they'll be targeting these subsidies directly to those who really vote and who really need the money. Anyway, so that is one very significant measure that has, I think, made, that is truly transformative, and that is a significant legacy of this government. Second is the DMIC, the Delhi-Mumbai Industrial Corridor, which is a project that is being partially, about almost 50% funded by the government of Japan. The Japanese are extremely enthusiastic about this. And this is going to create a significant industrial zone between Delhi and Mumbai. And there's now talk of another zone connecting Pune to Bangalore. But the DMIC in particular, coupled with the fact that there is a new manufacturing policy that effectively provides a compensation scheme for laying off workers and for environmental issues, that, I think, is the positive aspect. The obverse side of that iceberg is that there is actually something really quite positive. The new manufacturing policy and the DMIC as the corridor through which the new manufacturing policy will be implemented. And in the medium term, that, I think, will really help restore the vitality of the Indian economy. I remain very bullish about India in the medium term, despite the fact that I'm somewhat bearish in the near term. This year, the budget has done its bit. Unfortunately, it's only done a bit to fend off the rating agencies. Moody's already commended the budget yesterday. They said that the prospect of a rating downgrade has diminished. S&P is much more hawkish. S&P has an analyst called Joydeep Mukherjee, who really loves China and hates India. So he's still out there. He hasn't said anything yet. So we'll have to wait and see what comes of that. But at least the prospect of one of the rating agencies not going ahead with a downgrade is one clear benefit of what P. Chidambaram has done in this budget. Overall, then, I think this budget will provide at least a modest boost to economic growth. Despite all of that I've said, there is the UID, the new manufacturing policy, the DMIC. So all of that should ensure, along with the new investment allowance, that real GDP picks up to slightly over 6% in the next fiscal year. With economic growth picking up a little bit, you automatically get a boost to revenue, of course. And so the fiscal deficit should be in the region of about 5% of GDP in the next fiscal year. That is still an acceptable level. 6% is a danger mark, 5% is kind of acceptable, 4.8% would be lovely, but it's unlikely to be achieved. But at any rate, the improvements are modest, and that's why the stock markets haven't responded all that favorably to it. Chidambaram's reputation is based on the 1997 budget, which was actually never passed by Parliament, so happens. It was called a dream budget. So the markets always expect that there'll be another dream budget from Chidambaram, and most of the time, I'd say 6 of the 8 times he's presented a budget, he has disappointed. This time he disappointed less than most other times, and so we get a modestly better outcome. Thank you very much. Happy to take questions afterwards, but I'll hand it over to PwC to talk about the tax provisions.
Thank you, Mr. Basu. Our second speaker is Mr. Indranil Chowdhury, tax partner, PricewaterhouseCoopers India, who will share his views on proposed tax amendments in the budget. Mr. Chowdhury, please.
Your Excellency, Dr. Raghavan, Mr. Srivastav, Mr. Basu, ladies and gentlemen. This was the part A of the budget speech of the Finance Minister, what Mr. Basu just explained. If you watch the Indian budget, it comprises of 2 parts. The part A, which is talking about policies, measures the government has taken, will be taking, and part B, which is his tax proposals, which people very attentively listen to. This year, the tax proposals were condensed to a very few pages, so I don't have much to say. And I don't have much to say because in the part A of the speech, what Mr. Basu mentioned just now is all captured here in the snapshot. So we have a challenging GDP growth this year. We have the inflation, which is stubbornly high, particularly the food inflation, which is causing concern. The FDI flows have kind of lacking a bit of confidence, although the finance minister is out in the market, trying to boost the confidence of the investors. And it's very heartening to hear him again state that our foreign direct investments are an absolute necessity for the growth of the country. And we do have measures in small and medium measures in the budget for this year. The fiscal deficit and the current account deficit, as Mr. Basu alluded to, are a cause of challenge and is a cause of concern. The tax to GDP ratio, which as a tax professional we all look at, reached a highest in 2008 when the economy was doing well, just like the world economy before the slump happened in 2009. And it reached a double digit around that time, and it's since then significantly gone down. And in the composition of the tax to GDP ratio, the direct tax, which comprises of personal income tax, the corporation tax, and other taxes, play the major role. The indirect tax, the contribution of the indirect tax, essentially service tax, excise, manufacturing tax, customs duty, is coming down. So this year, what the finance minister has done is that in terms of his collection from corporate taxes and direct taxes, it's the highest. It's around 14,000 crores. And the contribution of the indirect taxes is around 4,700 crores. Totaling about 20,000 crores in the tax collection. And it is expected, and as he says that he's looking at improving the tax to GDP ratio over a period of time, he's expecting it to bring it up to the double digit that it was in the pre-2009 days. So that's the focus of the budget. And if you look at the tax landscape today, and the tax landscape is no different from the global tax landscape that we see, be it in the US or in the UK. We know the US president's focus in trying to tax corporations who are looking at safe harbors or safe havens to sort of park profits. We've seen the UK Public Accounts Committee, Margaret Hodge, going after corporations in the UK. Starbucks, everyone knows, is a case in point, volunteered to pay tax. So it's a different tax horizon altogether, and India is not decoupled from that. And the Indian tax administrators and revenue are looking at the world scenario, and obviously they are looking at Indian corporations in the same eyes. But the focus, again, the finance minister, as he says, is looking at a non-adversarial tax administration. There has been very aggressive audits in India, both in transfer pricing, which is the new area of taxation. And there's a trust deficit which has been created by the Revenue Department with these aggressive audits. And we have cases like the Vodafone, we have cases like the Shell, we have cases, and those who are following the Indian tax horizon would know all these reported decisions. And in this backdrop, again, it's very difficult to have a stable and moderate tax policy because in a slowing economy where the collections are going down, it is imperative for the government to look at newer and aggressively collect outstanding taxes. So we have certain aggressive measures also brought in the indirect tax areas where collections of demands have been aggressively being looked at. And also the budget talks about certain big bang reforms, the reforms which the finance minister, current finance minister, had tried to bring in his previous regime when he was the finance minister. That of bringing in the direct tax code. We were looking at getting the new direct tax code in place as of last year, which would replace the Income Tax Act, which has been there for the last 50 years, and this was expected that we would have the new direct tax code, which will take us to the next 60 years. And the big reforms in the goods and services tax, which again he has indicated that he's looking forward to the cooperation of the state finance ministers so that we have the goods and services tax in place in India shortly. So those are the two big bang reforms which are in the horizon for India. This is what we discussed. Two things out of this are important in this slide. One is the focus on infrastructure and manufacturing, and there are certain measures in the budget this year, both from the tax as on the policy perspective. The second one is, of course, the financial sector reforms. As many of you would know, that the Indian corporates can now open banks in India, so private sector banks are being encouraged. And there are certain incentives given on the capital markets and for the pension funds. We discussed this so far. In the last bullet here, that is looking at the Tax Administration Reforms Commission, this is what has been announced, that since we are very strongly coupled with the global economy, India needs to have a reforms commission where the latest developments around the world are scrutinized, looked at, and the best practices are taken from there for implementation in the Indian tax codes. This is what the current horizon looks like in terms of the foreign direct investments. We have opened up all our sectors virtually for foreign direct investments, but with different levels of caps in the foreign direct investments and with different levels of approval process. So some are under the automatic route and some are under the government route where you require specific government approval for investments. And the latest one has been on the retail side. As we know, the single brand and the multi-brand retail sector is now open for foreign investment into India. Quickly on the tax proposals, there's been no change in the tax rates, except that there's been a surcharge imposed on the so-called super rich. There have been talks of inheritance tax being introduced in India, and this is again in line with the global thinking. But fortunately, there was no introduction of inheritance tax. The finance minister said that out of 1.2 billion people in India, only 43,000 people are above 1 crore rupee. They declare their income over 1 crore, which is 10 million. And he wants to tax these individuals with an additional surcharge of 10%. As most of you know, the 1 crore income or the 10 million income in India is primarily in the organized sector, and there is a large unorganized sector which is outside the tax net, which is income a lot more than 1 billion. We would have appreciated that if we saw some measures in terms of broadening the tax net by getting in more people into that. However, the current 43,000 taxpayers who are earning more than 1 crore income would have to pay additional tax. There are certain incentives to first-time home buyers, and housing sector is getting a big boost in India. The first-time home buyers would get additional deduction of $1 lakh rupees on their tax computation. And there are certain rectifications which have been done in terms of the keyman insurance policy and in the immovable property purchases, where the recipient of the immovable property, the buyer of the immovable property, if he's getting it as a gift or is getting the property at a consideration which is not as per the market price, then the stamp duty is the value which would be taken in the hands of the individual. So this is very minor changes. In the corporate tax side, again, there's been a 10% surcharge imposed on higher income companies, essentially, who are more than 100 million rupees, a 10% surcharge, which has again increased the corporate tax rate from 32% to 33.9%. And that has effect on all the other related taxes, like the minimum alternate tax, the dividend distribution tax. And the taxation of foreign dividends in the hands of the Indian companies, there's a lower rate of tax on that as compared to the normal taxation. That has been extended by 1 more year. So an Indian company receiving dividends from overseas gets taxed at a lower rate, and the extension is there for the current year as well. And when such company distributes its income again to the shareholders, the flow-through is not taxed in the hands of the shareholders. There are 3 important things, changes which have been made to non-resident taxation. The first one, of course, is we know that India is looking at the tax residency certificate of the foreign investor in a big way. They have their own form, which has to be certified in the overseas tax office. And on that basis, the tax officer would give credit or would look at the transaction that is taking place from the overseas entity. And here, the tax residency certificate format was introduced last year. And it is following similar formats that are there in other countries. What India has done is it has increased the rate of tax for outflow of royalties and technical service fees from India from 10% to 25% on the basis that most of the tax treaties, and India has about 84 tax treaties with different countries, most of the tax treaties have that rate ranging between 15 to 25%. And therefore, he thought that it was an anomaly where India was taxing it at a 10% a lower rate, and therefore it should be brought back into that region. Of course, the tax treaties become very relevant because in some treaties, they do prescribe rates at 10% or 15%, which is lower than 25%. And those are the rates which would apply, provided the tax residency certificate of the non-resident is in place, as well as the beneficial interest, the beneficial ownership of the receipt of the income is proven. So this is something which is of importance for non-resident investors. What did not get addressed in the budget was the taxation of the indirect transfer of shares. And we've heard of this Vodafone case where the ownership of the Indian company was transferred at a level which was much higher in 2 or 3 levels above. And the government of India sought to tax the transaction in India on the basis that the underlying shares comprised the assets of the entire transaction, and the entire substance of the transaction was in India. And this went right up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court, of course, laid down the law that the government had no right to tax that. And as we know, last year, a retrospective amendment was brought in to tax such transactions. And we expected that the budget would address certain concerns, because the finance minister himself, after taking charge of the ministry, had formed a committee of Dr. Parthasarathy Shom, and Dr. Shom committee looked into these areas of indirect transfer of shares. It looked into certain other areas of taxation and brought out its recommendations, and we expected that some of those recommendations would find place in the tax statute for this year. Unfortunately, it was not so, and there was no reference of the finance minister to this particular aspect. And the ambiguity or the clarity that was much required by the non-resident community is still wanting. I mean, it still needs to be seen how we implement the Dr. Shom committee recommendations in the budget. The other area of taxation which got plugged was that of buyback of shares. In the past, a lot of companies were looking at non-resident companies looking at cash extraction or taking out in lieu of dividends. Instead of dividends where you pay dividend distribution tax, if you do a buyback of shares from an Indian company, you don't pay tax in India. And this was an aberration or an anomaly which has been sought to be plugged by the finance minister in the current budget. So the buyback of unlisted securities, not securities which are listed in the Indian Stock Exchange, these would now attract a special tax at 20%, not a dividend distribution tax, but a special tax at 20%. And the window that's available still is up to 1st of June. So investors until 31st of May can still resort to a buyback of Indian shares without paying any taxes in India. And from 1st of June, there would be a special tax at 20% with the surcharge and cess that is applicable on that. And this particular tax is, again, the question will come as to whether it is creditable in the country in which the investor is. And you know, it'll become like the dividend distribution tax that you have in India. And this is a new tax, and we would need to see that the arbitrage that is still there between a dividend distribution and a share buyback, whether of 3%, because if you pay a dividend, you get a dividend distribution tax of 17. You do a buyback, you get a tax at 20. Mr. Basu mentioned investment allowance. This is something which India had earlier, and then in its own course, not to provide incentives or subsidies, it had withdrawn investment allowance, and it was only depreciation or amortization of the assets. It's been reintroduced only for the manufacturing sector, not for the services sector, which means that the R&D companies investing in computers and software and other things would not be eligible to this investment allowance. And there are certain lock-in conditions, and so it's available for 2 years, provided you make that 1 billion investment in the first year. So that is the condition that has been imposed. This was another area of concern, the general anti-avoidance agreements or general anti-avoidance regulations, which India sought to impose last year in the budget. That has been deferred by further 2 years on the recommendation of Dr. Shom's committee, and this was one recommendation which the finance minister has accepted in the budget. The GAR provisions, of course, get modified to a large extent based on certain recommendations that Dr. Shom has made. However, certain other recommendations on clarity of grandfathering and retroactive applicability, etc., these have not been addressed in the budget. The adjudication process of GAR, again, is what is shown in the chart here as to what you do after the GAR provisions have been invoked in the case of a taxpayer. It's binding on both the revenue and the taxpayer. And again, they don't have a right to appeal. So there are discussions on as to whether such an enactment would stand the scrutiny of the courts. But we need to see that because it's still in the horizon. It's deferred by 2 years, which means that until April 2015, we will not have any legal GAR that is in the statute in India, but we still have the judicial GAR, which means that our judiciary looks at, and India has always looked at, substance over form. So something which does not make commercial sense has always been seen as a colorable device and taxable, subject to tax. There are certain sectors, as I mentioned, where the government laid focus on. The financial services sector, I mentioned banking. In the capital markets, there are certain instruments which are being looked at to protect inflation and assist the small and medium enterprises. The real estate sector has got a boost in terms of certain allocations in the budget, including the tax break for the first-time house buyers. The infrastructure sector has got a boost with the Bangalore-Chennai corridor and Bangalore-Madras corridor following the Delhi-Bombay corridor. And we expect that the manufacturing industry would get a boost in these corridors in a big way with the multinational investors coming in. Japan is one of the major contributors to the Delhi-Mumbai corridor with the Japanese government. There is a reference to the electronics manufacturing industry sector, where the government is looking at giving incentives to the semiconductor industry for manufacturing wafer fabs in the country. It requires large investments, and the focus of the government is there. The unfinished agenda, as I mentioned, the GST is on the cards, and he's very hopeful that he can introduce GST regulations in the next session of the Parliament. The Direct Tax Code bill, which has gone through iterations, and the Standing Committee recommendations are also in place, and he expects that the recommendations would be aligned, and we can have the new Direct Tax Code bill. As we know, the Companies Bill is before the Parliament, and it should be passed in the budget session expectedly. So these are some of the unfinished agendas, including the indirect transfer of shares, which I mentioned, should see the light of day somewhere. So with that, I conclude this talk on Part B of the budget, and we are all waiting eagerly to hear Dr. Raghuram Rajan. This is the finance minister's quote, actually, when he concluded, so I just thought I'll put it here. He said that all the strength and secure that India needs are all with us, the Indians. He quoted from Swami Vivekananda. And so he advised us to make our own future. So to that future, he has addressed this Indian budget, which I'm sure would go a long way in making India's future. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you, Mr. Chaudhary. I would like to invite Professor Srivastava, Mr. Basu, to join Mr. Chaudhary at the head table. I would also like to invite Mr. Abhijit Ghosh, tax partner, PricewaterhouseCoopers Singapore, to join the panelists on stage for the question and answer session. Professor Srivastava will chair the session. Professor Srivastava, please.
Thanks. I think I'll ask one question, which has been bothering me, and then we'll turn it over to the floor. Much has been made about the economic dividend, the demographic dividend that India will face, and it was then the first presentation. And I'm a little concerned because that demographic dividend, if not supported by government policies in terms of education and training, could be a pretty big economic disaster where we would have to support people rather than rely on them. And so I'd like to get a perspective from our panelists on that. PK, do you want to take a shot at it?
Yeah, sure. Oh, absolutely. I think the demographic dividend can become a demographic curse. The demographics of North Africa are rather similar to India's, but they have a very high youth unemployment rate, which then has the opposite consequence. So, so far, I'd say over the past 15 years, India has been benefiting hugely from the demographic dividend. But if the pattern of slower growth begins to set in and becomes entrenched, then you have a quite serious problem, of course. I think, to me, the clearest anecdotal evidence that at the moment there is no problem with employing this huge mass of young people is the fact that middle-class people in India complain constantly that there are no servants available. That, to me, is the best sign that the labor market is absorbing people sufficiently that people aren't willing to be domestic servants. You know, Downton Abbey has a certain resonance with Indians, I think. Until even 10, 15 years ago, Downton Abbey was quite a similar, most Indian households in urban India were similar to Downton Abbey. There wasn't an army underground, but there was at least there'd be one or two people. Just as in Singapore, of course, we have the post-colonial structure where in Singapore, most of them come from the Philippines and Indonesia. In India, there used to be there used to be a reserve army of the unemployed, as Marx would put it, that was ready to work in homes. That's not there anymore. So, and clearly, across urban India, that is still a challenge. People aren't able to find domestic servants. So, the vitality of the services sector, I think, is really what enables India to absorb workers at a quite fantastic pace. And the services sector, despite the slowdown in the economy, the services sector is the one sector that continues to grow at a good pace. What has happened to the economy is really that the manufacturing sector is stagnant at the moment. And that is completely unacceptable. India has truly missed having a proper industrial revolution. So I think the task for the next government is to ensure that there is a proper manufacturing industrial revolution that occurs, and especially now that China is reaching its more difficult phase of where the dependency ratio is rising, the supply of labor is beginning to diminish. There is an opportunity for somebody to take the slack. At the moment, it's Vietnam and Bangladesh that's taking the slack. India needs to sort its labor market situation out and ensure that there's a serious labor-intensive manufacturing revolution that occurs to really absorb the millions into not just services, but also manufacturing.
Thank you. We'll take questions from the floor. There's a microphone. There's a mic, if you could.
Hello, my name is Ashok Goyal. I have a boutique investment bank here, and I'm here in Singapore for last 4 years. My point is that there are three groups of persons who are generally interested in the budget speech. One is the economist, the accountants, and the common public, the persons who are the natives and persons who are the citizens of the country. And many people see it from very macro level of scenario. I think, as we saw in his presentation, Mr. Basu's presentation, the FDI has gone almost 50% last year. And there were 4 major reasons for that, which was the Commonwealth Games, the 2G, the Vodafone, and the GAR. And perhaps our finance minister has not spoken anything significantly about any of them. I mean, if you read all the newspapers for last 1 year, these are the 4 comments which have been all the time, which are eroding the image of India. I think one of the important points for finance minister, being the CFO of the country, is that he should think about the containment and the efficient use of the expenditure, which perhaps he has not been able to do in this budget. He has been finding all the tidbits here and there to raise few thousand crores from this particular transaction tax, or this few hundred crores from SUVs, which incidentally are including the luxury cars also. I mean, I have heard all the 35 budgets in my professional careers of 35 years, and 8 budgets of Mr. Chidambaram. Mr. Chidambaram is perhaps in the habit all the time to find out some new taxes. They may be small initially, but they are increased slowly and slowly. I'm not very sure whether the investment allowance or the surcharge which he has imposed this year, that would be only for 1 year or for many years. My request is that through you and everybody, we should convey that there should be a long-term stability on the provisions of tax. If there is an investment allowance granted this year, it should be there at least for 5 years, because this 15% investment allowance is available for a person who is investing 100 crores rupees of investment in the plant and machinery. I remember it was like 7 or 8 years back, the investment allowance was introduced and it was withdrawn the very next year. It was a different regime of the different government, but it was done. So my request is, Vodafone is still hanging. It is just $2 billion. With a GDP of India, $2 billion perhaps is a rounding figure. The image damage which it has done to the country is much bigger than that. The FDI, which was $35 billion, last year has come down to 17 or 18 billion dollars in this current 2012-13 year, is something which is much more dampening than doing anything. The second thing which is very discouraging and sometimes which is hurting, that only 42,000 people are paying 1 crore tax. It's not right. It is basically the taxable income which is 1 crore. It is not the gross income of 1 crore. I make 100 crores rupees as the capital gains long term on the stock market. I don't pay even 1 single penny. Mr. Mukesh Ambani may be getting like 10 crores rupees of his salary and making 100 crores rupees of the capital gains. He pays tax only on the 10 crores of the salary and does not pay any money on the long-term capital gains. Likewise, the dividend tax. Likewise, the sale of the agriculture property which is beyond a particular municipal limit, all of them are included in my gross total income. They are not included in my taxable income. So it is a very wrong message which is given to the whole of the world. Mr. Chidambaram is not addressing the country, he is addressing whole of the world, and he has painted a very bad picture that only 42,000 persons are giving income which is more than 1 crore. No, there are thousands and thousands and thousands of people who are having income more than 1 crore, but their taxable income perhaps is not 1 crore. So my request is that let's project the things in the right perspective. Let's not paint India in a bad image outside India. My further point is, and simple question from Mr. Basu, whether all this economic scenario, would it reduce inflation? Would my household expenses will go down? Whether I would be able to spend wisely and better? A simple question. I mean, for a common man, what are the things in this budget I'm not able to appreciate? For you, sir.
Well, I think you gave some questions, but I think you gave more answers, perhaps. So one comment, I think generally when we're looking at policy questions, they tend to be macro. My own perspectives are rather micro because I'm dealing with typically people from the business community. The big concern in my most recent trips to India has been on the part of availability of capital for expansion, and the non-availability of capital has been a very, very big issue in holding things back. But I'm no expert on tax policy, so many of your questions and recommendations are on tax policy, so I'll turn to my colleagues on the left.
I think if Mr. Basu answers the inflation question first.
Well, actually, maybe I'll also answer the question or comment on 2G, Commonwealth Games, etc. I think it's worth noting one thing, that all the scandals that India has had over the last 3 or 4 years were exposed not by the press, but by the Comptroller and Auditor General of India. So I think the fact that that happened, A, and B, the fact that Vodafone's complaint was actually adjudicated on by the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled in favor of Vodafone rather than the government. I think these two features are worth noting because they show the strength of India's institutions. There may be corrupt politicians, but there is a check, and the check exists in the form of this institution called the CAG. And similarly, you have the Supreme Court as a further check on the executive. So, despite all of the gloom and doom, the institutions are incredibly strong. With regard to inflation, I think that inflation is partly a consequence of Narega, the enormous spending on the rural sector, which has pushed up rural wages, which has its own benefit. The fact that rural wages have gone up makes it quite difficult for labor-intensive activity in the rural sector, no doubt. And some of it is, for instance, agricultural export commodities are struggling as a consequence. But that does have some benefits. It boosts incomes in the rural part of the country and so on. So I wouldn't say that it has no benefit. But there's also a lot of leakage and so on. And that, I think, is the major factor behind the much higher inflation rate that India has had. But it's worth noting that Singapore, for instance, has had much higher inflation in the last 2 years as well. It's to some degree a global phenomenon. I don't think the budget does anything to bring inflation down. It's not the purpose of the budget. I think the central bank has done its bit over the last 2 years, having done very little in the previous 3 years. The central bank has now acted quite aggressively. And so inflation is coming down. The headline inflation rate should be below 7% by next month on the WPI, and core inflation should be around 4%. So there is a moderation in inflation. I don't think the finance minister is either responsible for bringing that down, but the central bank has done its bit.
I think to add to what Mr. Basu said on the independent judiciary, and India still takes pride in an independent judiciary, one of the things you would have noticed is that there are no retroactive amendments in this budget, which is a very, very significant achievement. There is a deferment of the general anti-avoidance in terms with what the recommendation of the Dr. Shom committee has been, which is again a right thing to do. It is true that the issue on the indirect transfer of shares have not been addressed as the way we would have expected it to have been addressed, but we are hopeful that it would find its way in the thoughts of the government in the right manner. So I think there are a lot of positives in this. Abhijit?
All right, other questions?
Hi, my name is Pavan Gandhok from SMU. My question to either of the panel members, it's fairly safe to say it's a pretty dud budget. pretty flat reaction, not what the UPA government would have ideally hoped for, but given the political circumstances. Any thoughts as to what you think the UPA government, either the finance minister or the prime minister, could do as a follow-up at some point in the year to try and get a more positive reaction? Any specific items that you think may be possible that he could actually introduce given the political pressures?
Well, I think there are 2 or 3 things that I would hope to see, perhaps at some point. The finance minister did mention in his speech, like most of his predecessors have over the past, say, 20 years, that he's about to introduce the bill for the goods and services tax in the current budget session. So, sometime in the next few weeks, we'll have the goods and services tax bill introduced in Parliament. That, if the goods and services, the previous chief economic advisor in the last 2 budgets had also said September, that year is more or less when the GST is going to be introduced. If the GST can be introduced, it is potentially transformative because it provides a simpler form of taxation across the country, equalization of sales taxes across the country. It reduces the various imposts that you have on excise duties and so on and brings it all into a single regime. It'll be much more difficult to evade. It'll be easier to collect for the government. And from that standpoint, the GST is very potentially transformative. If it can be introduced at some point in the next few weeks, that'll genuinely be positive. But until it is, I won't believe it until I see it. I think that's true of most people observing the budget. And similarly, the direct tax code the reform of the direct tax code that has been mooted for some time, for several years, but hasn't quite happened. Those are 2 potential items that would be very positive.
If I may just add on, just on the direct tax code itself, what you saw in this year's budget, the increase of the surcharge, so the effect of that is an increase in the tax rate, okay? Now, when rest of the world, there are many countries, they are looking at making some headline announcements, reduction in the tax rate. And the DTC, which is the new code which was discussed, proposed a tax rate of 25%. So to be very pragmatic and to be very forward-looking, I think one of the issues that we should be looking at, that with the DTC, the government should start looking at reducing the tax rate and widening the tax base, rather than increasing the tax rate and taxing only 43,000 people.
Good morning. My name is Rashmi Gogna, and I'd like to take on the question that Professor Srivastav's opening remark on the concern over the dividend, the population dividend that our country has at this point. My question is that looking at the budget and looking at the population that we have in our country, I'm a bit alarmed by the allocation of budget to the education ministry. Compare that to much smaller countries. Any comments on that?
Well, I think the interesting thing about education is that, this government has increased allocation to education substantially, and it has made education compulsory until the age of 14. It's now constitutionally compulsory for children to be in school until the age of 14. So from that standpoint, there's been some progress. I'd say the important thing about education in India is that increasingly the state is failing to provide effective education, especially at the primary level. And so the private sector takes over. Like almost everything else in India, the private sector provides the solutions when the state fails. It's an unfortunate way of doing it, but that is the way it's happening. And I think there's been quite substantial progress in the education front over the past decade and a half. The literacy rate has has risen quite significantly, and the primary school enrollment ratios are more than 100%. So people are in fact staying in school, maybe in private school rather than government schools, but even the poor are willing to spend on education because they recognize the benefits of it. They send them to private schools. That is, it's a failure of government that it's not doing more on that front, but it's not a failure of India necessarily.
All right, I think at this stage we are going to switch over to our main act. This was, as I said, indicated earlier, the warm-up act.
Absolutely.
And our guest is online, so please, if you would.
Thank you.
I think we are very fortunate to have one of the world's leading policy economists as Chief Economic Advisor to India. So
Thank you.
he's the real act.
Actually, we will take a short break, a 10-minute break.
No.
No?
No. Let's keep going.
All right, okay.
Good morning. If I don't hear otherwise, I will start now. I see my remit as giving you a short overview of what the budget was trying to do and is trying to do, and then I'd be happy to take any questions that you may have. I think the starting point for this budget in many ways is our macroeconomic situation, which, as you know, we've had a period of very high growth post the global financial crisis, but after that we have slowed considerably. We were growing at close to 9% in the couple of years after the crisis, partly as a result of substantial stimulus both on the monetary and the fiscal front. But then after that, we had possibly excessively high growth. We had high inflation. The Reserve Bank of India started to increase interest rates substantially, and growth started slowing, not just because of what the Reserve Bank of India did, but also because of problems within the Indian economy, supply-side bottlenecks, for example, especially in food production, as well as certain difficulties in governance, getting the various environmental clearances, coal linkages, various kinds of permissions and so on, led to a slowdown in large projects over the last couple of years, which has also contributed to the overall slowdown and the depression in investment sentiment. Now, all this was happening even while the global economy had its own problems.